I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to talk about Aristotle's Metaphysics. To consider what is metaphysics, which better place to begin than at the beginning with Aristotle's Metaphysics? Aristotle is, however, not the first thinker to come up with a metaphysics. His teacher, Plato, had devised a theory of forms or ideas, and those before him have also been in search for the most fundamental principle of nature or arche. Aristotle will revisit their accounts, though his approach differs from theirs in two important ways. Firstly, the ancient Greek thinkers before him shy away from observation, depending only on their powers of reason. Aristotle will, in addition to his use of reason, also use observation. Secondly, he will approach the topic systematically, starting from how reason should be used to think correctly before using it accordingly. This essay is based on the notes Professor Henning Tegmeyer provided for my course in Metaphysics at KU Leuven. While I have read Aristotle's text, Metaphysics, it can be difficult for contemporary readers to understand it in the light of our current knowledge. Tegmeyer's lectures were critical in bringing together what is key, explaining the context of Aristotle's milieu, what they knew then which can differ greatly from what we know now, some of which we take for granted as given and obvious, though it clearly was not obvious then. The term metaphysics itself is revealing. Aristotle himself did not use the term. The title of the text was purportedly given by Andronicus of Rhodes, who compiled Aristotle's works centuries after Aristotle's passing. He was the head of the Peripatetic school, which is the school Aristotle founded. He felt that this particular volume should come after one has finished reading Aristotle's book, Physics, and hence named it Metaphysics, to indicate that it should be read only after reading the physics. The term metaphysics is meta ta physica in Greek, meaning after, above, or beyond the natural, but also about nature. Aristotle himself calls this branch of philosophy first philosophy, since it is concerned with the very fundaments of reality itself, which is being as such. It is the first philosophy since the question it is concerned with is the most general scientific one. While each science is concerned with being, they are concerned only with specific aspects of being, while metaphysics is concerned with being as being. Each of the sciences is hence limited, defined by its subject matter, but metaphysics, since it is most general, is a universal science. Today, the study of the nature of being is called ontology, a branch of metaphysics. Metaphysics can then be thought of as the nature of reality, reality containing being, but also more. As a universal science, metaphysics unites the specific sciences, ordering them into a whole system. What Aristotle wants to investigate in the metaphysics is the first causes and principles of being. According to Tegmeyer, for Aristotle, it is obvious that we do not have universal knowledge of being as such unless we have knowledge of first causes and first principles. To really know something, we need to know also its cause and the principles governing such causes. That is the kind of knowledge that a god would have, which also makes it theology, according to Aristotle. To understand nature, Aristotle wants to rely on nature as we experience it. This may sound obvious today with the prevalence of the empirical method, but Plato militates against such use of observation. Because Plato thinks that the sensible world is an imperfect copy of the intelligible world, we thus cannot from our experience of it know what true reality is. Aristotle, however, will attempt with his philosophy to explain phenomena rather than explain them away, the way Plato does. In the Metaphysics, he will critique Plato's doctrine of ideas and argue why the realm of ideas which it posits is flawed, where instead, what we can know is already all around us. By relying on experience, Aristotle implicitly believes that our perceptions reflect reality, which we then express in our thoughts and speech. But before he can embark on developing a metaphysical account, he needs a proper approach. Aristotle has to figure out how to reason such that reasoning brings us to correct conclusions. While he may not be the first metaphysician, he is certainly the first logician, inventing deductive logic that is still in use today. Logic is a universal tool for knowledge since it allows people to rationally derive true propositions from prior true propositions using rules of inference. The study of logic as a formal method began with Aristotle's syllogism, where two premises involving a common middle term, when the terms are ordered in the right way, leads to a valid argument and hence a valid conclusion. The syllogism is a sound argument, meaning one that leads to a true conclusion when both premises are themselves true. These premises have to be well-formed propositions. A well-formed proposition contains a subject and a predicate linked with a copula like is or are. S is P is a well-formed proposition. Aristotle arrives at the syllogism based on two principles of logic. In the Metaphysics, he explains the principle of non-contradiction, where a well-formed proposition cannot be at the same time both true and false. A corollary of this principle is the principle of the excluded middle, where a well-formed proposition is either true or false. It excludes the middle possibility of such a proposition being neither true nor false, though this does not tell us whether we can determine its true value. The second principle that logic depends on is the principle of identity, where A equals to A. Both these principles may seem obvious, but it is precisely because they are self-evident that makes them eminently suitable to be the foundations of logic. One important consequence of Aristotle's syllogism is that structure alone can tell us the validity of an argument. We do not need to know the details of what an argument is about to know if it is valid. While validity is assured if the structure of an argument is correct, it is the details that will tell us if the conclusions of valid arguments are true. In addition to the syntax or form, the semantics or meanings of the terms in arguments matter. Aristotle categorizes these possible details into 10 categories, detailed in his book aptly named Categories. These categories express the various ways a being can be. Aristotle's categories are meant to exhaustively capture the way being can be described, and hence be understood by rational beings. In a way, the categories are about language, and indeed Aristotle discovers what they are through how we use language. But in another way, the categories are meant to be ontological, meaning the categories do represent something real. To speak about a subject is to predicate something about that subject. Predication can take place in 4 ways according to Aristotle. 1. Species membership is when something is predicated of the subject without that predicate being possessed by the subject. For instance, 梅姐 is a human being. Being a human being is predicated of 梅姐, but she does not have the species of human being. Rather, that which is predicated is what she is. 2. Universal property possession is when something is predicated of a general subject which the subject has. For instance, people have the capability to feel. The capacity is in people as something people have. 3. Individual property possession is when something is predicated of an individual subject which the subject has. For instance, Chin Hong has the ability to run fast. This ability is something Chin Hong has as an individual, a trope specific to him, and is not universal since not every member of his species can run fast. 4. When something is not predicated of something and that thing does not have it either. Subjects are, for instance, not predicates. Ahmad is not predicated of anything. Instead, predicates are predicated of him. Aristotle considers this structure of predication to be ontological. We have individual objects and species, and individual properties and universal properties. Objects and species are entities that can have properties, while properties require objects to be attached to. Properties or predicates cannot exist independently of objects. Hence, objects are independent entities, while properties are dependent entities. Nonetheless, the fourfold structure is not exhaustive, since there are other modes of predication. While verbs can become subjects in a proposition, for instance, thinking is fun, one of Aristotle's main questions in the Metaphysics is, what is a substance? He proposes that independent entities, objects which are subjects but never predicates, such as Ahmad, Meijie, and Chin Hong, are candidates for being substances. However, thinking is not a substance since it can become a predicate. For instance, Ahmad is thinking. Properties and predicates that depend on the other entities for their existence are accidents. Aristotle refers to individual independent entities like Ahmad, this house or this table as primary substances. He refers to species and genera of primary substances such as human being as secondary substances. Substances are regress stoppers. They are the starting and stopping points for chains of predication. For instance, male, Asian, brave, happy, thinking, running, and so on is predicated of Ahmad, but Ahmad is not predicated of anything. Substances as independent beings ground the dependent modes of being of predicates and properties. Substance is the first of 10 categories Aristotle comes up with to describe nature. Properties make up the remaining 9 categories. They are quantity, quality, relation, time, place, having, position, action, and passion. The 10 categories are meant to be exhaustive of modes of predication. Immanuel Kant will much later suggest, or rather accuse, Aristotle of having arrived at these categories likely from analyzing ordinary language and from empirical observation. This is right, since Aristotle does use observation as a means of learning about reality. Franz Brentano, however, demonstrates that the categories can be obtained deductively, though he believes that having and position are redundant. Aristotle himself does not expand on these two, but does so for the others. Each category can be considered a genus, of which they are comprised of species. For quantity, they are discrete and continuous quantities. For quality, they are states and dispositions, potencies, sensuous qualities, and shapes. Relations connect entities together. Action is the act enacted by the active being on other beings, while passion is being acted upon by active beings. Time and place tells us when and where. Having is about possession. Position is the position of an object which can be subsumed under place or relation, such as before or after something else. The 9 categories excluding substance are called accidental categories, modes of being that are dependent on their substance and are the highest genera of dependent being. Aristotle proposes a correspondence theory of truth, where the structure of propositions that are true map onto the structure of reality. Correspondence requires a match not just between the parts of a proposition and the parts of reality that they refer to, but also the order within the proposition should be the order found in reality. Hence, Aristotle intends that the division made by the categories of substance and accidents be not just in language but is ontological. According to Aristotle, terms are predicated of things in three ways: univocally, equivocally, or analogically. Univocal is when two objects belong to the same genus. For instance, both birds and dogs are animals. Equivocal is when two objects said to be the same do not belong to the same genus. For instance, a person and a picture of that person. Analogical is when the same term has different meanings when applied to different objects but are ordained towards the same fundamental meaning, such as healthy being applied to eating fruits and to a person. For the fruit, it means to bring health to a person, while for the person, it means the person is in a good state of health. On the concept of being has many meanings, but these meanings are analogically ordained towards one meaning, which is the being of substance, a substantial being, even if Aristotle also uses the term being for accidental being. Accidental being, which are described by the accidental categories, depend on substantial being. Hence, being is not univocal but analogical. Being is further determined by him to be unified, good and true, since a real being can be regarded as one thing, is at least potentially good, and exists, hence grounding true thoughts about it. The terms of being, unity, goodness, and truth will later be known logically as transcendentals because their meaning transcends the categories. John Duns Scotus will later reject the analogy of being, arguing for a univocal concept of being through a radical nominalism, where species, genera, categories, and transcendentals have only logical functions but do not correspond to anything real. Tegmeyer explains that the categories of being can be understood as ultimate criteria for classifying being in a universal taxonomy. But what makes these categories ontological? As noted, Aristotle derives the categories by examining language through everyday predication, which are linguistic expressions of how we experience the world empirically. However, what if the nature of our experience is in doubt? Pyrrho is a contemporary of Aristotle and is best known for his radical skepticism on the possibility of empirical knowledge, since there is no guarantee that human perception matches with reality. In order to obtain ataraxia or calmness, his school advocates apohe or suspension of knowledge until such time when certainty can be attained. Other skeptics known to Aristotle include Heraclitus, a pre-Socratic who thought that everything is in flux. Hence, knowledge of things seems impossible. Plato, in response to Heraclitus, formulated his metaphysical theory of ideas or forms, which posits an intelligible realm where there is no change, while recognizing that Heraclitus is right that the sensible realm which we live in is in continuous change. Aristotle rejects Heraclitus's premise altogether, which also explains why he rejects Plato's theory of forms. We perceive not only change, but also stability and endurance, and Heraclitus is hence empirically refuted. As for Pyrrhonic doubt, Aristotle thinks that it is hyperbolic and unwarranted, throwing out the baby with the bathwater by being overly concerned with the fear of erring, such that it also discards the possibility of truth. For Aristotle, forming judgments and having opinions are part of the human essence as rational being. In addition, even animals have preferences and behave as if they have opinions about things. To not have opinions is hence to be like plants, which he denigratingly compares skeptics with. To be wrong is the risk we have to take in order to gain knowledge. Besides, we can self-correct and thus overcome error in our collective efforts of thought. Substances undergo changes. In the categories, Aristotle talks about 4 pairs of change: generation and corruption, growth and decline, qualitative change, and locomotion. The first two are substantial change, while the latter two are accidental. Change is originary if it has its own causes, while it is accidental if it is caused by a collision of originary changes, explains Tegmeyer. Accidental changes can be random and hence indeterminable. For Aristotle, substances comprise of matter or hyle in Greek, and form or morphe, hence making his theory of substance hylemorphism. Matter is the material out of which a substance is composed. Form is the essence of a substance. It tells us what the substance is. This hylemorphic conception of substance implies two limiting cases: pure or prime matter which has no form, and pure form which has no matter. We never encounter prime matter since all material substances we do encounter are formed, even the elements which in his time are only four: fire, water, air, and earth. Prime matter is an abstraction that Aristotle claims to exist because once the differentiating component of form is removed from substances, we will be left with prime matter. Aristotle's argument for pure form is different. He will insist that pure form exists, and it will be central to his theology since God is pure form. Form and matter constitute substances but also causes of change. Matter changes when it receives a form to become a substance. Form is a cause of this change, causing the substance. Form also causes the substance to persist in time as the cause of its stability and endurance. Matter is also a cause. It causes the coming into being of a substance and its destruction by its passive receptivity to forms. Matter makes change possible because it is changeable. Matter needs to be in the right condition to take on a form, and this appropriately receptive matter is termed proximate matter. For forms to actualize a proximate matter, an agent is required. This agent is termed the efficient cause because it is the agent causing the effect. Changes often happen for the sake of a purpose or goal, and this is known as the final cause. Not all changes have a final cause, for instance, accidental changes. These four causes, formal, material, efficient, and final causes, are the four kinds of causality that can exhaustively explain any change. At least one is required for any change. Form is what segregates substances into species. Thomas Aquinas early on interprets Aristotle as considering matter to be the principle of individuation, because members of the same species embody the same form in different portions of matter. What individualizes the members of the same species must hence be their matter. However, he changes his mind when he realized that Aristotle's view is that the relation between form and matter is complementary in each particular primary substance. Tegmeyer explains, a particular portion of matter cannot be brought into a definite form unless the form itself is a particular form. Forms themselves are particular. For instance, the souls of living beings, which are each unique. This is one reason why Aristotle does not consider artifacts to be substances, since they are the result of serial production multiply realizing the same form, as so many instantiations of a single universal idea. Since Aristotle now tells us that forms are particular, he will use the term essence to denote what is universal about a substance. An essential definition of a substance tells us what a thing is by determining its higher proximate genus and its specific difference. Specific as a technical term referring to difference between species within a genus. The roots of the words specific and generic come from species and genus. An example of an essential definition is how a human being is of the higher proximate genus animal, and the specific difference human beings have from the other species, their rationality. So human being is defined in their essence as animal with rationality. How essential definitions are related to matter and form is that genus is grounded in matter and the specific difference is grounded in form. The bodies and forms of conspecific living beings are identical species-wise, but numerically different, while for artifacts, the form of a mass-produced chair is not numerically different though its matter is, making the unity of form and matter, which is Aristotle's conception of substance, less tight. Are artifacts then substances? They seem to fulfill Aristotle's criteria for substantial being, since they have numerical identity, belong to a species, and can be indicated by using the word "this." However, unlike natural substances, they do not come into existence from natural causes, but are produced by human artifice using a common form. Their numerical identity is also contested. An ancient puzzle over the ship of Theseus exemplifies this. If a ship had its pieces progressively replaced with newer pieces while at sea, and the old pieces are taken and reconstructed to form a whole other ship, say in a museum, which is the actual ship of Theseus? It cannot be both, since they are numerically unidentical. Natural substances do not face this problem. Aristotle hence concludes that artifacts are not full-blown substances, but are imitations of natural substances. Art, as an artifice, imitates nature, and he uses this principle in his philosophy of technology and art, as in aesthetic art. How about defining the categories? Based on the formula for definition as proximate genus and specific difference, since categories are the highest genera of being, there is no way to define them since there is no specific difference. Some concepts are so general and basic, such that they are undefinable, though we can give examples in order to inductively elucidate them. In this way, Aristotle thinks we have an everyday understanding of substances and the accidental categories, such that we know intuitively that horses and rocks are substances, while colors, motion, and position are accidental to the substances. Aristotle conceptualizes both time and space as relative, dependent on material substances. A certain place is the place that a certain body occupies at a certain time. Space is then the totality of all places, places being the possible locations of bodies. The vacuum is an abhorrent concept for the ancient Greeks and is not believed to exist. Hence, Aristotle rejects atomism, since atoms are thought to be extensionless points moving in empty space. Matter for Aristotle is not discrete, but continuous and infinitely divisible. Time is defined by motion. Time is the measure of motion and change. Motion is measured by other motions, such as the movement of the hands of a clock, or planetary bodies such as the sun and moon, which through their motion gives day, night, months, and year. Aristotle believes the universe is uncreated and eternal, making cosmic motion eternal. Since there is always motion, there is no need for absolute time, and since there is always the universe which contains substances, there is no need for absolute space. Aristotle makes another distinction using modality. Modality is about possibility and necessity. He uses the terms act and potency, where change is an actualization of a potency. Act is the root for action, but also actualization. Action also fits here insofar as action brings about an actualization of potential. Potency is related to potential insofar as potential indicates that an act is possible. For instance, an object that can be black or white is currently white. That is, it is actually white, though it potentially can be black. The object can be white because it has the potency to be white, and this potency is actualized, making the object actually white. If, however, the object does not have such a potency, then it is impossible for it to be white. More generally, if an object does not have the potency, then this non-existent potency cannot become act for the object. If an object has a particular potency, this potency may remain only a possibility and not become actualized, or it may become actualized, in which case the potency became act. Further, there are active and passive potencies. Passion in scholasticism, which is philosophy based on Aristotle, does not quite have the same meaning as our contemporary usage. Today, passion is to have a great interest or emotion to do something, but the scholastic meaning refers to passivity, where the passive object is not the source of change. Rather, an external agent is the source of change. This idea vaguely remains today, since passion can mean a desire which a person cannot control, making that person passive. To be active means to be the source of change. Hence, an active potency is a potency to bring about change, while a passive potency is a potency to be changed. They come in pairs, since for change to happen, there needs to be an active source causing the change and a passive target which is changed. If either is missing, change cannot happen. In Aristotle's schema of form and matter, form bears the active potencies, while matter bears the passive potencies. Forms have the power, the active potency, to cause matter to change, while matter has the passive potency to be changed by the active potency. There are also rational and non-rational potencies. Most substances are non-rational. For Aristotle, there is only one substance that is rational, and that is human beings. Non-rational potencies only work in one direction. For example, fire has the potency to heat things, but not to cool them. Human understanding, however, has the potency to think true and false thoughts, and our agency has the potency to do good and bad things. Such two-way rational potencies then give us the freedom of choice that non-rational substances do not have. What is outlined so far applies to all things, making it Aristotle's general metaphysics. He also has a special metaphysics which is on psychology and theology. For him, psychology relates to biology, a physical and metaphysical study of life. The metaphysical question is what differentiates between living and non-living substances. Both have prime matter, so the difference must be their forms. Living substances have forms different from the forms of non-living substances, and Aristotle considers this form of living substance to be soul. For him, all living beings have souls. Living beings are capable or have the potencies of maintaining, preserving, and reproducing themselves. These potencies must then be the potencies of the soul. The soul is the bearer of active and passive potencies that enables living beings to survive and flourish. However, souls of living beings have different powers. Aristotle develops his account by examining the powers of plants, animals, and human beings, which result in a cumulative hierarchy of the vegetative soul, the animal or appetitive or sensitive soul, and the rational soul. Plants survive by converting inorganic matter into organic matter as their nutrition. They reproduce and can self-maintain by repairing damaged tissue. Aristotle considers these powers as the powers of a vegetative soul. Animals also have the powers of the vegetative soul, but in addition, they have the powers of perception, desire, and locomotion. These additional powers are the powers of an animal soul. Human beings, in addition to the powers of the vegetative and animal soul, have the power to understand their perceptions, the power to distinguish between good and bad, and to prefer the good. The power to understand, Aristotle calls the theoretical part of human rationality, while the moral power is the practical part. These two parts belong only to the rational soul. So a human being has the power of the vegetative, animal, and rational soul. Each soul, while it contains the powers of the various souls, is unified. The three types of soul are a hierarchy, with the powers of the higher souls superior to the powers of the lower souls, though they do not always control them. Human beings, through their rational powers, have control over their movement, which is a power of the animal soul, but not certain powers of the vegetative soul, such as metabolism. The idea is that the superior powers should ideally govern the inferior ones. For instance, a rational control over our animal desire. Moreover, this ability is not automatic but requires effort. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle elaborates a virtue ethics where human beings must acquire virtues in order to establish the order of the soul proper to rational beings, so that there is a proper cooperation between the different parts and powers of the human soul. His ethics hence has a metaphysical basis. The rational part of the human soul is called the intellect. The powers of the intellect are very different from the other powers of the soul. It is immaterial and not tied to bodily parts. Perceptions provide thought with content. Thought is thought of immediate perception or of perception mediated through other thoughts. Perception comes through the senses. Each of our senses has their proper object, such as visual perception through the eyes and audio perception through the ears. Some objects are perceived through multiple senses, such as the image of fire through the eyes and the heat of that same fire through the skin. However, our senses are limited. That same heat cannot be seen through the eyes, and the image of fire cannot be felt through the skin. We do not see sound or hear color. The intellect, by contrast, has no proper objects. It is able to grasp everything as a universal power of cognition. The senses are also limited in terms of the intensity of the sense perceptions. If the light is too dim or too bright, we will be unable to see objects. Our senses may even be damaged if the intensity is too high. The intellect does not have these difficulties. It is not damaged by objects that are too easy or hard and can still cognize them. The senses perceive the accidental properties of their objects, but the intellect has the ability to go beyond the superficial to cognize the essence of the object. Even if the sense organs are damaged, the intellect is not damaged. Aristotle believes this to be the case even when the brain is damaged, though cooperation between perception and thought may be adversely affected, since he thinks the brain is where the different sensory inputs are coordinated. The capacity to think nonetheless remains. Hence, he thinks that the intellect is immortal and somehow divine. This seems incongruent since the soul is a unity, meaning that the vegetative and animal powers are as required as the intellective ones. If the vegetative and animal parts of the soul are mortal, the soul as a whole must be mortal. Averroes will later argue that the intellect is not a proper power of the human soul, but the essence of God which we participate in passively, though there is no consensus on this. Regardless of the intellect's mortality, because the intellect is immaterial, not tied to matter the way other parts and powers of the soul are, free will is tenable. Material objects are caught up in causal structures. Nutrition, perception, and desire are involuntary. We cannot willfully control our metabolism. Though we can close our eyes, we cannot control what is seen when they are open. We cannot prevent desire from arising within us, though we can decide whether to act on them. Precisely because we can control our actions and behavior, we seem to exert our will freely and as agents. Aristotle explains that this freedom of the will comes from a twofold freedom of the intellect. The theoretical intellect is free from the limitations of our senses. This allows us to grasp reality as it is, and not just as it appears to us, because we can know the essence of things, writes Tegmeyer. Our thinking transcends the information that the senses provide towards essences. Secondly, the practical intellect is free from the limitations of our desires and feelings. Desires and feelings come from our sensuous nature connected to bodily functions. They drive us in certain directions, but we have the ability to consider them rationally and control their expression. Hence, there is a contingency in human behavior. We are not determined and we have agency because of our intellect, according to Aristotle. Recall that since substance is the combination of matter and form, if we have pure matter, that will be prime matter, which is also pure potency, that can become anything. While if we have pure form, which is also pure act, this will be God, according to Aristotle. However, this pure form will be devoid of matter, making it immaterial. Is this possible since it defies Aristotle's hylemorphism, where form cannot subsist without being embedded in matter? Aristotle denies the ontological reality of the Platonic forms and the Pythagorean ideal pure mathematical objects, considering them only as mental abstractions which derive from actual forms of material beings. They have no mind-independent reality. Yet Aristotle does believe that there is at least one immaterial substance which is pure form and is God. He thinks that God is necessary. The world is full of motion and change. Change is metaphysically the actualization of a potency. Potencies do not self-actualize, requiring something actual to bring about the act that actualizes the potency. Change needs a bearer of the act of change, an appropriate situation in order for a potency to become actual. However, the existence of the bearer and situation is a result of a prior potency. This will lead to an infinite regress of which nothing can become actual unless there was a first purely actual being, which would then require no prior potency. In this way, God is the source of all actuality. This being must be a substance if it is to exist, and yet it must also be completely immaterial in order that it is pure act, since prime matter is pure potentiality, and hence there must be no matter whatsoever within this being if it is to be pure act. Thomas will later argue for the existence of God in 5 ways in his Summa Theologiae. In the first way, Thomas thinks he is building on Aristotle's argument that God is pure act. It is about how God is the first mover and first efficient cause of the world. Aristotle assumes that the world is eternal, with no beginning. Because the world is eternal, but yet requires a first efficient cause, this first efficient cause must also be eternal. Thomas, however, does not explain why an eternal world will require a first eternal cause. Tegmeyer suggests a possible answer. Efficient cause and effects form causal chains. At the bottom of the chain is the movement of the celestial bodies, since that is the cause of the climate, day, night, and the seasons. Yet these bodies do not move by themselves, but their motion must have been set off by something eternal, since these bodies are themselves eternal since the world is eternal. If what sets these bodies in motion itself is set in motion by something else, there is an infinite regress, so the argument will fail to explain why there is any motion at all. Hence, for there to be motion, there needs to be a first mover which itself is unmoved. This prime unmoved mover is God. This argument may seem quaint today since we now know from Newtonian mechanics that the motions of the planets are not due to any agents setting them off, but due to gravity and hence not requiring an efficient cause. However, Isaac Newton affirms that God is needed to create the laws of nature, such as gravity, which will then set the universe in motion. Even the Big Bang theory can be considered compatible with divine creation, since it can be God's way of creating the universe. In addition, while Thomas views his first argument of God as the first efficient cause, as an extension of Aristotle's argument that God is the first and pure act, Aristotle thinks that God as an efficient cause will violate the pure actuality of God, since being an efficient cause seems to imply that one actualizes a certain causal potential that one possesses, explains Ted Meyer. This is incompatible with the nature of God as pure act. If God, however, is not the efficient cause, how then can he be considered the first cause of the universe? Recall that Aristotle's structure of causality has 4 causes. If God is not the efficient cause, how about the material, formal, and final cause? God is not the material cause, since he is immaterial as pure act, while prime matter is pure potency. He is not the formal cause, since God and the cosmos has different forms. This leaves God as final cause. God cannot be the aim of things because they can never become God or possess God, since they are limited and God is unlimited. However, if what is desired by things is divine perfection, and if the desire of things is to be as good as their final cause, then in that way God is the final cause. This draws on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where what a thing is and what is a good specimen of a thing means the same. To imitate God's goodness is to then engage in one's proper activity in the best way, which is to accord with one's essence. Hence, being good consists in an optimal actualization of one's essential potencies, explains Ted Meyer. In fulfilling one's essence, one is expressing their love of God, which is why God is the final cause. Another way Aristotle explains God as the final cause is that his divine command is the source of cosmic order and motion, the command then being the final cause. In conclusion, Aristotle is Western philosophy's first great systematizer. He first develops logic as a method on which further knowledge can be confidently developed from simpler premises. Using his keen powers of observation, he comes up with 10 categories which cover all possible types of predication. He then investigates the fundamental ontological question, which is what a substance is, before addressing how it can change and the causes of change. From the findings of his general metaphysics of hylemorphism, where substance is the combination of matter and form, he develops 2 special metaphysics on human psychology and theology with God as pure act. Based on his metaphysics, he will also develop virtue ethics. Thank you for listening to the Philosophical Bachelor.